soul apart.
Hellraiser, as a series, kind of became a joke there for a while. There are 11 entries in the series, but after the first two, enjoyment of 3 and 4 notwithstanding, the series became a joke for a solid stretch of the 2000s. Many of the movies weren't designed to be Hellraiser properties at all, but Pinhead was shoehorned in like a second-rate slasher villain to make it work.
Shall we begin?
Sure, we had some fun actors and directors strewn about, but mostly, they fell flat. Even the 2022 reboot, which was a bit divisive, but overall received well, didn't quite have the same charm as the original film. The first movie was based on Clive Barker's novella, The Hellbound Heart, and in a first on this show, the author was also behind the writing and directing of the movie. Shed no tears as it's a waste of good suffering while we find out what the fuck happened to this adaptation. Hellraiser is a 1987 film written and directed by Clive Barker based on his own novella. He'd previously written an original script for a movie called Transmutations, or Underworld, that was made in 1985, and an adaptation of his own work Rawhead Rex the next year. But ultimately, he was unhappy with how both those turned out. Those movies were successful enough that Hellbound Heart was optioned and Barker was allowed to write and direct it himself. It was released in September and made $14 million off its $1.6 million budget. This would of course lead to all the previously mentioned sequels, but apart from being an executive producer on the first 3 sequels, Barker would have no involvement. The cast would include the screen debut of Ashley Lawrence, Doug Bradley in a career-defining role, Andrew Robinson, Sean Chapman, and Claire Higgins. Barker would go on to write and direct Nightbreed and Lord of Illusions based on his own works Cabal and The Last Illusion, as well as write the stories for the Candyman sequel Farewell to the Flesh and a few smaller projects here and there. Ashley Lawrence made her first film with Hellraiser, but has had a steady horror career with a couple Hellraiser sequels, The Underseen Mikey, Lurking Fear, and the third Warlock film. She also did a couple of episodes of the new Creepshow revival and an episode of channel favorite Monsters.
Come to Daddy.
Andrew Robinson showed up in Pumpkinhead 2, Child's Play 3, Trancers 3, and loads of TV, including some directing gigs.
Presto, you're a ball.
Sean Chapman and Claire Higgins don't necessarily stand out like the rest of their co-stars do, but as Frank and Julia, they're great in their roles. Chapman would come back as Frank in Hellraiser 2. Higgins, who hated horror movies and walked out 10 minutes into the screening of Hellraiser, came back for the immediate sequel, as well as more recent fare like The Sandman and a 52-episode turn on The Worst Witch. Finally, we have Pinhead himself, Doug Bradley. Bradley actually was an old friend of Clive Barker, and the two founded a theater group together in the 70s. His first 3 movies would all be Clive Barker adjacent projects, with the first 2 Hellraiser movies and Nightbreed.
Coming to Hellraiser, I had worked in the theatre with Clive Barker for a decade before Hellraiser happened, and we had always done a lot of masking work. We'd done a lot of Commedia dell'arte inspired work, mime, and I've always as well been interested in masking.
He would go on to play Pinhead for 8 films, more if you count video games and shorts, and became horror royalty with that role and his other varied appearances in the genre that helped make him famous. The book, or novella in this case, was written by Clive Barker and published as part of the Night Visions anthology series before eventually getting a standalone release in 1991. It would eventually be known as the first installment of the Hellraiser series, with the second installment, The Scarlet Gospels, coming in 2015, and the third installment, Hellraiser The Toll, coming in 2018. While an early piece for Barker, it wasn't his first. His first outing in the world of publishing would be the Books of Blood story collection from 1984. Hellbound Heart was inspired by Barker's turn as a male prostitute in the 1970s. He wanted to, quote, tell a story about good and evil where sexuality was the connective tissue, and much of the look of the Cenobites was inspired by underground S&M clubs he saw in New York and London. One of the early names of the film adaptation was even Sadomasochist from Hell, although that and the joke title offered from a 60-year-old crew member of What a Woman Will Do for a Good Fuck were shot down in favor of Hellraiser. We already discussed the filmmaker side of Barker, but he's also a playwright, artist, and designer. He has novels such as The Damnation Game, novellas like, well, today's subject, and is working on a book of poetry. He's helped design action figures with his Tortured Souls series in the early 2000s, and his Infernal Parade line with famed toy creator Todd McFarlane a few years after. Barker has even been involved in some video games through the years. A PC-exclusive first-person shooter hybrid game called Clive Barker's Undying was released in 2001, with another original story called Jericho coming out in 2007. Even before that, we saw two different kinds of adaptations for his Nightbreed property. One game, Nightbreed the Interactive Movie, is a hybrid of point-and-click and exploration that came out for the Atari ST, DOS, and the Amiga. Nightbreed the Action Game was a more traditional side-scrolling actioner that came out for the three previously mentioned systems, as well as the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and Amstrad CPC. There was supposed to be a third game, an RPG, but it never came to fruition. More relevant to today's story, and I'm still not sure if it's real or not, is an unreleased NES game on the Hellraiser property. That would have been a wild one. Barker's one hell of a creator, pun intended. He's intelligent, creative, and can seemingly do it all. Check out any number of the things he's put out into existence, although you may already have and not realized it, like Candyman being based on one of his short stories. Quite a lot is the same from page to screen, and I'm sure that's in no small part to the original author being the writer and the director. Sure, they don't always have complete control due to producers or the MPAA interfering, but a lot of the minor differences here were creative choices by the man who created both. The story starts with a sleazeball of a man named Frank acquiring a puzzle box that he has been searching for. Once opened, he is torn apart in every conceivable way by the creatures not of our dimension. Sometime later, a man and his wife move into the house that Frank was ripped apart in. It was Frank and his brother's grandmother's house, and the man, Larry, says that Frank hasn't been around for ages. Julia, his wife, finds photos of Frank that remind her of when they made love right before their wedding. In fact, they had aggressive sex on top of her wedding dress. A girl, Kirsty, here Larry's daughter, comes by to help them move in, and Julia clearly doesn't like her. Larry has an accident and comes upstairs to the room Frank was dissolved in, and his blood causes a reincarnation of Frank, but not completely. He starts as a shadow of what he once was, an organic memory fused together with blood, desperation, and passion. A housewarming party ensues with Larry holding court and Julia miserable with the company, her husband included. Julia goes off to bed and stumbles across the remains of Frank, who tells her he needs more blood to become whole again. Julia hatches a plan for her true love and goes to a bar to lure a man back. Once back at the house, she seduces the man into the upstairs room where Frank waits. She kills the man in a gory way, and Frank takes over with the consumption to begin to make himself whole again, basically draining the man of all his sustenance. Larry comes home as everything is finishing up, and Julia must hustle to conceal the crime. Frank needs more time to complete his transformation, but he wants to leave as soon as possible before the Cenobites realize he's gone and come back for him. Julia repeats the steps and kills yet another man. Frank now has pain and other senses back. Frank makes too much noise upstairs and is almost caught before Julia takes charge of the situation and narrowly avoids detection. Larry asks Kirsty to speak with Julia, and when she arrives, she's confronted by a still skinless Frank. She fights him off, eventually with the box, and wakes up at the hospital before solving the box herself and inviting the Cenobites in. They plan to take her into their world of pleasure and suffering, but she offers up Frank, and since they can't go back alone, they agree to trade for souls. Frank and Julia kill Larry, and Frank takes his skin now to complete the transformation. They intend to trick Kirsty, and they do at first until he says, "Come to Daddy," just like Frank did.
Come to Daddy.
She scratches his face, and when he tries to kill her, he stabs Julia by mistake. A chase ensues where Kirsty finds one of the previous bodies, and the Cenobites arrive to claim their prize. They obliterate Frank, and Kirsty is able to escape them with the box. Very little was changed from page to screen, and what was has little bearing on the story as a whole. The box is called the Le Marchand configuration after the box's creator, and it would be known in later movies as the Lament configuration. Larry was originally named Rory in the novel, and while Kirsty does nearly everything the same in both mediums, book Kirsty is an old friend of Rory who is in love with him. While this doesn't change how the story plays out, it gives the overall story a more incestuous tone. The Cenobites are largely the same, but in the story they have no gender description. The lead Cenobite is not Pinhead in the story, but an engineer that we don't see in the movie. The larger, non-human shaped creature that chases Kirsty in the hospital and eventually the house is non-existent in the book, and Pinhead seems to take the place of the engineer in the movie. They are also part of the Order of the Gash in the book, which probably made the MPA throw up in its mouth, and it's not mentioned in the film. Other smaller details are Julia using a hammer in the film, or her weapon of choice is a knife in the story. Kirsty in the film also has a love interest that is unnecessary in the book. The way Frank returns was changed too. I was going to say toned down, but we do get an incredible practical effect where he reforms in the movie. In the story, Frank first opens the box, and every sense he has goes crazy at the same time. To get some sort of clarity or conclusion, he relieves himself on the floor. The blood from the accident that Rory has mixes with the semen that Frank left, and that's how dimensions are opened. Finally, the ending changes slightly. In the movie, Kirsty finds Julia holding the box while running from the Cenobites, but in the story, they're not chasing her. Kirsty flees and runs into the engineer who is torturing Julia. The engineer gives Kirsty the box as the new warden, and she thinks she sees Frank and Julia inside of it. She then hopes that Rory is in another box that has a better ending where she can find him one day. Both of these properties have great legacies to their names. Hellbound Heart is a wonderful introduction to the works of Clive Barker, and eventually it would get 2 literary sequels. Hellraiser would be his directorial debut and give us, for better and for worse, a ton of Hellraiser movies. With that movie's success, we also got many more adaptations and a couple more Barker-directed films that, in my opinion, have only gotten better with age. These are both rich in their value and hold up wonderfully nearly 40 years on.
A mentally unstable man is put on an old, soiled mattress. The doctor hands him a razor, and the man begins to slash himself over and over and over again. Arms and legs emerge out of the mattress to grab onto the man as he bleeds all over. Beneath him, a face slowly emerges out of the mattress. It has no skin, but as it opens its eyes and a smile spreads across its face as if in total ecstasy. This is one of the early, graphic, and gory scenes in Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. As with any horror sequel, this movie looked to up the gore factor, but what extremes do you have to go to when the first film is Hellraiser? Director Tony Randall wanted to take the intimate first film and push it into a cosmic hellscape with bigger ideas and even bigger set pieces. With this, we go to hell itself to explore where the Cenobites came from and the length some will go to find the ultimate secrets of pain itself. With that, it's time to find out what the f*** happened to this horror movie with Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. While the first Hellraiser was still in post-production, New World Pictures could easily see that it would be a hit film and greenlit a sequel. Barker had already moved on to other things, but he was still heavily involved with producing the movie and turned to Tony Randall to take over the director's chair.
I think Tony's vision, Tony's grasp of the of not just of horror filmmaking and its various techniques, but of science fiction as well, will bring a new flavor to bear on the lament configuration, on the Cenobites, on all of that.
Having worked together before, Barker knew he could trust Randall to push the story forward without him breathing down his neck the whole time. In Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, we open on Elliot Spencer, Doug Bradley out of makeup, trying to open the puzzle box. Unfortunately for him, it works, and he is pulled into hell. There, he is transformed into the being we've all come to love, Pinhead. From there, we jump to the present. After the horrible events that killed her father and evil stepmother in the first film, Kirsty has been remanded to a psychiatric hospital. She pleads her case, but is seen as just another crazy person. Well, by everyone but Dr. Chenard. While being a successful man of science, he has had his eye towards the occult and has become obsessed with the secrets of the underworld. To further his pursuit, he gains possession of the bloodstained mattress that Julia died on. He offers it the sacrifice we talked about earlier, and Julia is brought back to life in all her skinless glory. Witness to this without Chenard knowing is his assistant Kyle. He now returns to the hospital and tells Kirsty that he believes her. Together, they go to Chenard's house, where we now see that Julia is almost successfully reformed after Chenard had brought her some more patients. Kyle gets trapped by Julia and is drained by her. Chenard returns home with another patient, who just happens to be Kirsty's new BFF from the hospital, Tiffany. She is mute and a savant at puzzles. After she opens the puzzle box, the Cenobites arrive and open the portal to hell. Pinhead decides that Tiffany is innocent of opening the box, as she was used as Channard's tool to open it, and he is the one who should be taken to hell. Channard and Julia travel into the depths of the dimension. It is an unrelenting labyrinth that is ruled over by Leviathan, a sentient giant form of the puzzle box in a diamond form. Channard realizes that this universe is beyond his comprehension and wants to leave.
Oh my God.
Julia, instead, pushes him into another chamber where he is tortured, deformed, and becomes a new Cenobite. Kirsty travels into hell to find Tiffany. Once there, she sees her father's old house and enters, hoping to find him. Unfortunately for her, all that she finds is Frank, who is once again trying to escape from the clutches of hell. Julia shows up and relieves Frank of his heart. Kirsty and Tiffany escape once again, but Channard shows up to grab Tiffany. The Cenobites actually protect her, per Pinhead's statement before about her being innocent. New Cenobite Channard easily dispatches with them, and they return to their previous human forms. As you can see, there was a gigantic story they were trying to tell compared to the small story of Frank invading an unsuspecting family while being chased by Hell's Cenobites in the first film.
I remember.
This vast story would need a bigger budget, and New World Pictures was eager to provide it. Just as cameras were about ready to roll, New World's financial issues started to catch up with them, and the budget ended up getting cut. While some of the big set pieces survived this, a few smaller scenes ended up getting scrapped out of the film. While the film opens with a curious Elliot Spencer opening the puzzle box and succumbing to his torture, there was supposed to be a bigger subplot surrounding the Elliot Spencer character. This would have explored how Spencer would have ended up with the puzzle box and how he ended up becoming Pinhead in further detail. It all had to be scrapped before shooting, and the opening scene was all that remained. This would end up getting picked up and explored more as part of Hellraiser 3. This also led into a larger subplot, showing how all the Cenobites used to be regular humans that had given in to the call of the puzzle box. Barker wanted to explore this idea more in the sequel. We get small glimpses of this as the Cenobites are destroyed by Channard towards the end of the film. The backstories were supposed to be a bigger part of the story, but ended up getting cut before filming happened. With the Chatterer, a scene that explained his renewed eyesight was cut in the editing room. In the first film, the character had no eyes. This caused the actor problems, as in costume, he couldn't see, couldn't talk with his prosthetic teeth, and could barely hear. For the second time around, he requested that the character have eyes. They built the explanation into the film, which is why the beginning of the film has the original design, but later he appears with eyes. Lots of fans have been irked by this design change since the film came out. Since it was a storyline of his return sight, maybe they would have been far more forgiving.
Oh, Kirsty. So eager to play. So reluctant to admit it.
During the scene where he is killed off by Channard, the character falls back onto the wooden pillar where he is impaled and spins until the camera reveals his original form of a young boy. Just as the camera shut off, one of the hooks dangling by the chains from the ceiling ended up grabbing hold of his mouth. People that were there commented it had been the absolute perfect scenario for it to happen. The hook managed to get into his mouth just as he opened it, went past the prosthetic teeth that were on the front of his mouth, past any layered foam around his mouth, and catch on the inside of his cheek. He says the only thing he could say was, "Teeth out, nurse in." Other actors on the film joke that he has dined out on that story for decades now. Kenneth Cranham, who played Dr. Channard, was also doing a play in London at the time with Gary Oldman. When he told Oldman about the film, he said he was jealous, as he would love to play the part in a horror film. 4 years later, Oldman went on to play the title character in Dracula. It looks like he got his wish, and really we could use more Gary Oldman in good horror films.
I like these calm little moments before the storm.
One of the original actors that returned from the first film was Oliver Smith. He was the actor that was slim enough to fit into the skinless Frank suit for the first film. Since he was only seen with no skin, it was easy to fit him back into these two roles for the film. He showed up as the skinless man in Kirsty's vision of her father. Here, he basically looks the same as he did in the first film, but his identity is mistaken by Kirsty for her father. This leads her to go to hell and look for him while trying to protect Tiffany. His other role let him wear a lot fewer prosthetic pieces, as he was the mental patient Channard uses to resurrect Julia in the hard-to-watch mattress scene. In the documentary, Leviathan, the story of Hellraiser and Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, he said these scenes were a lot of fun to shoot. When inserted into the film, I don't know if they seem like much fun, but they got the intended results out of them. One original actor who opted not to return was Andrew Robinson. The The character of Larry Cotton was featured heavily in the end of the original script for the film. Kirsty was to have found him when she finds Frank in the finished film. It would be discovered that Frank and Larry are actually joined together by the arm as conjoined twins. Here, they were both tortured for Frank's misdeeds. They would be forced apart, and Larry would help Kirsty and Tiffany escape hell. He would have been the one to kill Julia. This would lead to him having a heart attack, which would see him rushed to the hospital. There are some claims that this led to the infamous deleted Pinhead surgeon scene that many fans have wondered about for decades. On the original VHS box and other promotional artwork, there are pictures of Pinhead and the female Cenobite in doctor's scrubs. The rumors began that a surgery scene was so gnarly it had to be cut in order to be released. This turned out not to be true when the scene was finally found on an old VHS workprint and included in the box set from Arrow Films. When presented with the script, Andrew Robinson said he felt there really wasn't much for his character to do in the film and opted not to return. For screenwriter Peter Atkins, he said he was actually happy that Robinson didn't return. He claims that he loves Robinson as a person and as an actor, but he never liked the idea that the character of Larry was in hell. He states that in his mind, Larry would have gone to heaven after he was killed by Frank and Julia. Having him stuck in hell made no sense to him, and this easily reverted to Frank being stuck in hell and trying to make Kirsty think her father was there so she would release him. Even after all the pitfalls, budget cuts, and non-returning actors, Hellbound Hellraiser 2 still managed to finish production. In the end, and expanded on the scope and characters of the original. Its next roadblock was the dreaded MPAA. Upon its first submission, the MPAA gave it the X rating. This means their advertising opportunities are pretty much non-existent. While it did take a few small cuts, they were finally able to get it down to an R rating. Barker thinks this was due to him preferring to show explicit displays of the grotesque rather than hinting at it. Even if Barker was right, one critic was not a fan of the film, and that was Roger Ebert. He said, quote, "The images have been constructed with a certain amount of care and craftsmanship. The technical credits on this film run to 4 single-spaced pages. We see lots of bodies that have been skinned alive so that the blood still glistens on the exposed muscles. We see creatures who have been burned and mutilated and twisted into grotesque shapes and condemned for eternity to unspeakable and hopeless tortures. But this movie violates more rules than the first rule of repetition. It also violates a basic convention of story construction, which suggests that we should get at least a vague idea of where the story began and where it might be headed. This movie has no plot in a conventional sense. It is simply a series of ugly and bloody episodes strung together one after another like a demo tape for a perverted special effects man." He says that like it's a bad thing. Hellbound Hellraiser 2 would go on to be cheered by horror fans everywhere. It was a true example of expanding on the characters and the mythos of the original film. What they didn't know was that the series was headed down a dark path, as the Weinsteins would soon get their hands on the franchise and drive it into the ground. I think we can all agree that someone who seems to put his selfish, earthly pleasures above all else would be so deserving of a visit from our pin-headed friend to be pulled down to the absolute depths of torture and pain. F***ing Weinsteins. Those of us who have been a fan of the Hellraiser series know that it's tough to get through the last half of the franchise. While the series starts off great, it has a quick decline right after the rights were acquired by... let me check my notes here. Oh, f***ing Weinsteins.
I would tell you excuse me for spitting on you, but you.
Big surprise, but before they got their grubby little hands on meddling in the series, they started off by distributing one. Hellraiser 3 to be exact. This sequel would end up being the highest grossing sequel of the franchise, before the Weinstein stink would relegate the series to straight-to-video hell. Before this film could be made, the rights changed hands between multiple companies and caused multiple delays. New World Pictures and Clive Barker's company, Film Futures, met about a third entry into the franchise before Part 2 had finished filming. Barker's idea was to center the future sequels around the Julia character, but Claire Higgins opted not to return to the series. Her character was killed off in Hellbound, and they decided to move forward with other ideas. Some included possibly setting it in ancient Egypt, Pinhead trying to resurrect himself, or an entire building becoming a lament configuration. Glimpses of these ideas would make their way into the final script. Before the movie could move forward, financial problems arose. Future films had problems after 20th Century Fox had demanded drastic changes to Barker's film Nightbreed. After a horrible marketing campaign and fumbling of that film, Nightbreed died at the box office and put Future Films out of business. New World had its own issues and ended up having to declare bankruptcy. After the smoke cleared, former New World exec Lawrence Cuppen formed Transatlantic Entertainment with the idea of grabbing a few New World properties to create sequels. This included Hellraiser, Children of the Corn, and a few other smaller properties. With new owners, they began to look for a writer and director for the sequel. One of the filmmakers they approached was a pre-Lord of the Rings Peter Jackson. He ended up turning them down. Jackson didn't feel his style of filmmaking would lend itself to such a serious horror film. While he admitted to liking the final product, he said, quote, "If I made a Hellraiser film, I'd like Pinhead to be whacked against a wall and have all the pins flattened into his face. I immediately started thinking of funny things and gags. That's just the way I am." They originally thought about bringing back Tony Randall, who had directed the second film. He was already working on the script for Part 3 with Peter Atkins and seemed an obvious choice to jump back into the director's chair. After realizing his take on this film would end up being too bleak, they decided to go a different direction. While the first two films had been dark and nightmarish, the new producers wanted to go on a more mainstream route. They felt the dark tone Randall would bring would push away casual moviegoers and wanted a more fun film with broader appeal. A person on the production team suggested Anthony Hickox, as they had just worked with him on Waxwork 2, Lost in Time. One person who wasn't a fan of this idea was Clive Barker. He had not enjoyed Hickox's previous work and thought he was completely wrong for the series. The producers moved forward with Hickox anyway, and when Barker met with him, he told him he had to take the work seriously and not turn it into a comedy. Hickox agreed and would use the previous two films as a template. After the events of Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, Pinhead and the puzzle box have been trapped in the Pillar of Souls. It is bought as an art piece by nightclub owner JP. After taking it back to his apartment at the club, he discovers that it craves victims. As he feeds women to it, Pinhead begins to regain his body. On JP's tail is an investigative reporter named Joey. She witnesses a victim of the puzzle box being brought into the ER and becomes connected to the young woman, named Terry, who now possesses the box. They begin to uncover who Pinhead is and how to stop him from reforming into our world. Spoiler alert, they don't, and Pinhead gets released from the Pillar of Souls. He goes on to create a new band of Cenobites, as he does, and takes his fight to the streets. The only thing that seems to be able to help them defeat Pinhead is Elliot Spencer, who is what is left of Pinhead's earthly form before he became the Hell Priest. Joy gets pulled into a dreamlike world where Elliot shows her how his curiosity caused him to become the evil Pinhead. His humanity was pushed aside so that all that was left was the evil being who would bring pain to those who opened the puzzle box for decades. She realizes they need to be joined back together so that Pinhead can be defeated once and for all. Since we're on Hellraiser 25, we can see how well this plan would end up going. While the film seemed to be pretty wide open in scope, Transatlantic only gave Hickox 6 weeks to shoot the film. They banked on Hickox's reputation to be able to shoot films quickly to lower production time. He preferred to work long days to shoot as many scenes as he could and tried to do as much in-camera editing as possible. This was frustrating for most of the actors as they didn't have a chance to perfect their performances and didn't give them a good idea of what the film would look like. The studio was quite happy as it reduced production time and editing time. Since there wasn't as much coverage as usual, there were few choices when the film finally got to editing. Doug Bradley said, while he enjoyed working with Hickox and the rest of the cast, this was the most uncomfortable Hellraiser set he had worked on. During the first part of the movie, he had to act while stuck within the pillar. This restricted him to just the use of his face and voice. He had other issues, including the Pinhead makeup, which the effects crew had changed. They had made it with fewer applications, which made it easier to apply, but had made it more uncomfortable on his scalp. The tracks the pins were laid into on the underside of the makeup sat harshly against the top of his head. His only saving grace for this film was that he had found an optician to get him a prescription pair of black lenses that were required for Pinhead to wear. This made it so he could wear them longer and help stay in character. While Hickox had found a way to shoot the film quickly, he still encountered a few hiccups while dealing with the cast and crew. During the sex scene between JP and Sandy, the actress refused to do the scene topless. After multiple back and forths, while trying to figure out a solution, it was finally agreed upon that she would appear topless and that JP would be holding her breasts during the scene, thus covering them from the camera. While every actress shouldn't be forced to do anything she's uncomfortable with, it comes off as an odd choice when you view the scene. When it came time to do the infamous Black Mass scene, Hickox couldn't get a real church to agree to let them shoot there. Weird, right? I can't imagine why a church in conservative North Carolina would have a problem with a movie about a leather-bound masochist from hell returning to Earth and desecrating holy water with pure evil during an unholy communion. Not to mention mocking the pose of the crucifixion.
I am the way.
Hickox used a set behind an altar to get the same effect. Some of the cast and crew were put off by the scene and began to complain that it was pushing things too far. Hickox swayed the claims by pointing out that it was no different than any number of Hammer films where Christopher Lee rampaged through churches in the Dracula films. After using this example, most of the crew agreed and stopped complaining. Christopher Lee can stop just about any argument. By the way, facts are facts. Along with Pinhead, we get to see some new Cenobites be created. Joey's cameraman Doc gets turned into a Cenobite with a camera in his head. The DJ from the club turns into one that can shoot CDs out as a weapon. And we also get a flame-throwing one that is wrapped in barbed wire, played by screenwriter Peter Atkins. Peter Atkins has said that while most fans don't enjoy this one, he has fond memories of the film, since he not only got to play the bartender Cenobite, but he also met his future wife on the set. Who couldn't fall in love among a bunch of evil-looking demons in leather and crazy contraptions on their face? After filming had wrapped, Transatlantic began to shop the film around. The Weinsteins expressed interest in Miramax putting the film out. Hickox claims that he sent an early cut of the film and that he loved it so much that they gave him extra money to clean up some effects and to redo the ending. Weinsteins can't leave any film ending alone, apparently. Fucking Weinsteins. If true, then it helped pay for some CGI imagery, making this one of the first horror films to use the emerging technology. Clive Barker rebuffs this story by saying that after Cuppin showed him an early cut of the film, he was unimpressed and refused to take an executive producer credit on the film due to its cheap-looking effects, not to mention the horrible ending, in his opinion. Miramax asked that he come on board to help fix these issues, and he claims responsibility in additional scenes of gore in the nightclub massacre and the CGI scene of Lee's character getting skinned. With all these changes, he accepted the executive producer credit, and the film was given a Clive Barker Presents label. Satisfied that his complaints were fixed, he began to promote the film along with Candyman.
As our third picture begins, the husk of Pinhead, the thing which is the monster, which has no moral qualms whatsoever any longer, is free on the earth.
Little did Barker know his biggest battle was yet to come. The MPAA decided that the film needed some major cuts before it could be granted an R rating. Barker has claimed his outspokenness on social issues and the increasing popularity of the Hellraiser films had caused such scrutiny from the MPAA. He says that he thinks they thought the previous films were too obscure to care about. They not only went after the actual film, but the initial poster had Pinhead screaming. The MPAA decided this was too disturbing and told them to remove the character from their marketing campaign. Miramax decided to use a composite photo of Pinhead from the original movie's poster. After the MPAA tried to claim it was too disturbing, the studio was able to successfully claim that it had been deemed appropriate during the first film's marketing, and the MPAA had to give in. Well, it can be said that taking a property that had a cult following and trying to shoehorn it into a mainstream box could be bad. This film actually got a lot of praise from critics and fans alike when it was released. It would gross more than any other sequel in the franchise. The downside is that this film could be linked to the series being churned out to such a degree that the original became so diluted that every film after the second just about lost any meaning. Or we can all agree that the Weinstein brothers are to blame. F***ing Weinsteins.
Human names, human memories, they have no place nor meaning in our existence.
After this film, the franchise went on to be controlled by Dimension Films and the Weinsteins across two different companies. While Bloodline had shown some fun ideas, Pinhead in space, why not? In the end, it was the last gasp of the franchise on the big screen. From there forward, it would be relegated to the direct-to-video market. Scripts that had nothing to do with Hellraiser would be retrofitted to shoehorn Pinhead into them to make new, less than good Hellraiser movies that had nothing to do with the original lore and mythology of the characters. Just when hope seemed to be on the horizon and the rights were about to expire, a film was thrown together to keep the rights in-house for the foreseeable future. Clive Barker himself had expressed interest in getting the rights back to do a proper remake of the property, but the grip that the Weinsteins held onto the series was a firm one. Once the company fell apart because of Harvey Weinstein, the company and reports indicate that Clive Barker has regained the rights to the original movie. This gives him control over the original film, which would let him add remakes or sequels to the series. One question is, will we ever see Doug Bradley in the makeup again? He stepped away once the movies were being made just to hold on to the rights to the series. Hopefully, a good story can bring him and Clive back together again and create more bloody hell together. This is a reunion that could bring a tear to the eye of any hardened horror fan.
Back in 1996, we got the fourth and final Hellraiser movie, one that promised to end Pinhead once and for all, only to see the actual death of the series' theatrical run. Bloodline's critical mauling alongside its dismal box office showing relegated Pinhead to the dark era of straight to DVD/streaming ever since. Even Arrow's original Scarlet box set left it out intentionally. But flawed as it may be, the ambition and character focus gives this a far longer shelf life than most would like to admit. But with the Weinstein drama and director Kevin Yeager walking away from the project, actually removing his name, we have been waiting a long time for a proper cut. One that would restore and respect Yeager's original vision, or at least come as close as we ever could try to get. Now, is the newly Arrow-released work print the version we've been waiting for? There will always be a certain charm for the Hellraiser quartet. Clearly the original is a classic and for good reason, with the sequel being pretty respectable for having Clive step away from the director's chair. 3 is where the 90s schlock and MTV influence takes hold. And then we get Hellraiser Bloodline. Now let me be clear, Bloodline has never deserved the hate and shame it's received over the years. This has been the one sequel that's ambition and concept has always fascinated me. It does a lot of heavy lifting for a 4th entry, which should be coasting on the fumes of a dead horse by the 4th flick, let's be honest. But somehow it tries to make a character piece where Pinhead is put back in the background, where he works best, and why actually Hell on Earth dipped its toes into the pool of awfully good. Let's be honest, he talks too damn much. You see, Bloodline ties itself into the ending of Part 3, which continued with a pillar from Hellbound, making this the 4th and final chapter in the continued Hellraiser saga. It's both a prequel and a sequel to everything that has preceded it. It goes for broke. It may not always land, but I gotta give it credit. It's trying to do more than a generic cash grab sequel. Now this review won't be a scene-by-scene comparison, but an overview of this new cut, so, spoilers. I'm gonna break it down to 3 sections: general additions, changes, and overall differences, what works and what doesn't, and if this stands as the ultimate cut for Bloodline, because it is pretty clear we're not getting anything else after this. Starting off on the creation of the box and the turning of Angelique, we get 2 major differences that change the tone and the overall story's trajectory. The space wraparound story is removed completely and we jump right into Jacques and DeLeo's trap and sacrifice of Angelique. But no box and no interruption from Philippe Le Mouchon. And it's actually the princess herself that comes up with the idea of the box and has DeLeo commission its build. I mean, changing that alone gives Angelique a different presence here. Where in the theatrical, her and Pinhead's relationship is hinted at more sexual. It's angry, but there is a bit of lust here. But in the work print, as in obviously the original script, it's way more competitive. Also, this is the first official release, and I'm not counting the YouTube fan-made work print, that showcases Valentina Vargas' actual voice.
Please help me. Please help me. I'm restless. And you're bored.
I'm restless. You're bored.
No idea why they cut it. I completely disagree. Though I think the dub is great. In the theatrical run, you should have kept her voice. A sexy accent and it works better with the character. We then cut to the current year of 1996 and are introduced to the architect John Merchant. And here, it's where the movie kind of stays. We get some extended scenes, more gore, and fleshed out motivations. Like, for instance, Jacques' death is extended, as is the Twin Maker. Both, I think, were obviously cut for an R rating. Things like the pull Angelique has on Merchant is more pronounced and more clear on her siren-esque pull. Bobby's suspicion of John's infidelity is explored more as well. Even a few added seconds here and there give her honing in on the box buried in the cement from Part 3 a bit more weight. Merchant's dreams are the way we flash back to more of the past, because the entire 1796 story is basically summed up in the very first scene here. And the way we jump back is through dreams and flashbacks. And we get warnings from Merchant's dead grandmother, flashes of Le Mouchon witnessing Angelique's deadly aristocrat games, and it's here we get the glimpse of the libertine Cenobites. There's small changes like Pinhead, not the box, using the chains against Angelique, Dr. Paul Merchant giving his confession to an AI priest. Not to mention using the future as a kind of last act twist is impressive. Being the start of the household PCs and internet in 95, I do wonder, they may have actually gotten away with it. You know, if they advertised it in a way that just completely hid the future from the film, it could have worked. A different universe and a different time, but it's some food for thought on what if. Now, what works? Well, this official work print cut tells a far more focused and fleshed out story. Motivations make more sense, or at least are given more of a setup. And the linear edit gives the structure more weight, with 1996 being the main focus. The gore is better, though I really can't show you anything since YouTube became a bitch. And you can see the ideas that writer Peter Atkins had in mind and what got Yeager interested in the first place. Angelique's threat against John is what makes him run home. Dr. Paul Merton sacrifices himself instead of leaving on the ship. Like I said, it's a lot of little things, not too many big overall changes, but in the end, it leads to a more satisfying story. Now, what doesn't work? I think the additional theatrical elements of the 1796 add a lot of gravitas and character development. While the work print does a great job fleshing more out in the 96 story, the 1796 gets a bit shortchanged. We don't see Sean deliver the box, while his talk with Auguste via flashback seems awkwardly shoehorned in the work print version, while cutting the Genevieve character out entirely. Now, I do like the new scenes in space, though with the wraparound segment being removed, this part also feels more rushed. And this is where I think preference comes into play. I've always felt the future segment was shortchanged in the theatrical cut, and it's more so here. See, I like that the ship in the theatrical has an odd flat shape that in a twist becomes the box of lights. Now listen, I know it's not a great twist and it's somewhat obvious, but I enjoy it as a final f*** you from Merchant.
Endgame demon.
The idea of the anti-box is more clear. The work print version focuses less on it being the tool to end the Hell Priest and his minions, and more of an overall portal. Now, I can't say the work print is the ultimate version we've been waiting for. You see, Atkins published the screenplay in 2021, and I cannot recommend it more as the full story is weird, elegant, and epic. You know, in my heart, I'd love to see this somehow, maybe even in animation form, but I don't think we're ever going to get it. Hellraiser Bloodline's work print finds the story as a solid start, but with its missing parts from the theatrical, a lot that were like additions and reshoots from Joe Chappelle, it is more of a give and take. Yeager's cut to the studio after cutting scenes and budget is kind of what we get here. And it's ambitious and it's good and it's a great start, but it is missing something. It has heart and a more realized direction, yet what is missing is what would help beef up the other two sections. So, in the end, I'm glad to have it, I'm glad it exists, and I finally feel like I have the saga completed. Because Hellraiser will always be 1 through 4, the theatrical run. It'll be one I revisit often, it'll be one I study. But to edit back in some of the missing theatrical footage would create, in my humble opinion, the closest we will ever get to a great cut. But hey, I'm just happy to live in a time where these lost editions are getting their day in court. It's a good time to be a horror fan, huh? Seems like we're actually eating pretty good. And if you are interested, I will link my review in defense of the theatrical cut after this.
For God's sake. Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
The theatrical run of the first 4 Hellraiser movies will always stand tall, regardless of how you feel about each individual entry. They were strange and unique stories that defined the late 80s and early 90s, both darkly bitter yet also a bit sweet, like honey from the bee. But anyway, what if I told you Bloodline is far more of an interesting story than it gets credit for? A more fitting ending than the character has gotten ever since. It's a messy ride, yes, but it's one worth taking. So let's pick your pleasure, rub the box, because this is Hellraiser Bloodline. Screenwriter Peter Atkins, who helped co-write parts 2 and 3, came up with an ambitious story that finally killed off Pinhead. Now, Barker was pretty hands-off for part 3, as the studio got cheap and refused his involvement fee. But wanting a proper cap-off, he came back for Part 4 as an executive producer. The issue is that Bloodline was the product of Dimension and of course the Weinsteins. This had the unfortunate luck of having them go back on the script they themselves had already greenlit and give director and special effects extraordinaire Kevin Yeager enough of a headache during and after production that he quit and took his name off the movie. The draft Yeager turned in was 111 minutes, and the one that we got was 82. So yeah, shit went down. Hellraiser Bloodline is the fourth and final film in the original lineup. It's the last to hit theaters before the long and brutal winter of straight-to-DVD sequels. You know, where Pinhead played more of a Rod Serling character. I think The Twilight Zone, only produced by the Asylum. Bloodline's entire purpose is meant to be the true ending that tied up the ever-growing saga in a poignant way. But before it came Hellraiser 3, it was the series' misguided attempt at trying to turn Pinhead into the next Freddy, with him taking on more of a prominent role, way more dialogue, and some neat action, if not a bit out of character for the series.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Now, I do have a soft spot for Part 3, but the schlock and fun that we got just wasn't quite right for this dark and sexual series. You see, the scope and Bloodline is what's always impressed me, taking place in 3 different timelines, 1796, 1996, and 2127. And with each generation a swing and a miss in terms of taking down the Hell Priest. But with each miss, the bloodline of the Toymaker evolves. Merchant learns and grows. Bloodline acts as a prequel to the original and a sequel to Part 3. And even with the low critical and fan response of Parts 3 and 4, I gotta be honest, there is a charm to the convoluted way the 80s horror icons contained their stories, regardless of the writer and director. And nowadays they reboot, remake, they just change shit. But back then you always had to start where the last guy left off. And it's something I always just kind of found creative. Simpler times, really. But in this sequel, we get to see the plight of one man's ancestry trying to defeat the Hell Priest and Cenobites once and for all.
Hell is what I'm going to catch, and I'm gonna burn it away in a blaze of light.
We get to learn about the creation of the original box and its creator, Philippe Le Merchant.
Finest toy maker in France.
Or Merchant later on.
John Merchant.
We come to understand the original good nature intent of the box, and how it was commissioned from a devil-worshipping aristocrat.
As precise as your pieces.
Hellraiser Bloodline gets back to the basics. It shifts the focus away from Pinhead, which is the right move, or, the best it can with the Weinsteins f***ing with the chronological order of things, and Merchant, played by Bruce Ramsey, and Angelique, played by the stunning Valentina Vargas, are far more interesting characters to follow. Now listen, I love Paul Marshall and will always be Team Warlock too. I mean, let's be honest, Julian Sands is a king, but Bloodline paints a more interesting journey with these two. Regardless of studio interference, these are better characters to follow. Angelique serves as our demon foe, and she gets enough screen time as our hero does, making this story equally hers. And honestly, this is the change the series needed. And it's a nice turn of events following the villain and hero on somewhat equal footing. And unlike Julia, Angelique is at a disadvantage, with Merchant almost a predator without being aware he is one. We see her struggles and proverbial dick measuring with Pinhead. She's more fleshed out as a demon looking to replace her superior. Her relationship with Pinhead is more distrusting and aggressive, yet flirty with a bit of sexual tension.
You look like death, princess.
And again, a departure from the Cenobites' servant-like behavior that's come before. We jump around 300 years with Angelique trying to stop Merchant's bloodline from creating an alternate box. A box to negate the powers of the original and close the door between the worlds for good. And to be honest, of all the ways Pinhead and the Cenobites have been stopped, the idea of a good box, a box of light, is a clever way to play itself. A box of light to defeat the box of darkness. This expansion of the original mythology complements what's come before, without delving too deep or dumbing it down. The 90s were infamous for over-explaining our 80s horror icons. But Bloodline never gives us any real answers, besides the creation of the box. The bigger story threads are still kept vague enough to mystify and entertain. You can give this movie as much crap as you want, but it doesn't over-explain. And the idea of a new box being the only salvation is smart, honestly. We were brought into the Hellraiser universe with a box, and it's a box, which will be our only way out. Having each male in Merchant's bloodline being drawn to the creation of the box is a cool story beat that finds a way to keep itself fresh with the time jumps into different eras. Bloodline gets a hard time. One, because it's clearly cut to pieces, but more than that because it ends up in space. And that's where we as a society have decided that horror franchises go to die. But Bloodline uses the space setting to further the story and has meaning behind it. It's not futuristic for the sake of it.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, of course not.
We end up in space because it's taken this long for Merchant's bloodline to find the technology it needs to create the box. It's the journey discovery that leads to the destination in 2127. The setting directly ties to the crucial information in the story, setup and payoff. But honestly, I think my biggest issue with the space setting is that they should have designed the space base in a way that didn't give away the twist of it being the box itself. Even the script describes it this way, so I guess I can't really complain, but I think designing it differently so you didn't know right away would have been a better way to punctuate the ending. And though it's a short, pieced-together movie, trapping Pinhead in a box, completing the centuries-long battle, is a fitting ending, and one that doesn't feel cheap or forced. It ends the saga in a satisfying and conclusive way, and it feels right.
What have you done?
I have faith in the light. Endgame demon.
Regardless of how long the series continued on after this, Bloodline has the right ending for you to tip your hat, acknowledge the closure, and walk away. Flaws in production aside, Part 4 came out swinging, ditching the Earth-made Cenobites who sported camcorders, CDs, and cocktail shakers, and gave us the melded security twins, whose fatality kill is fantastic. Angelique with her nun dressed like flayed flesh. And side note real quick, I really wish we could have got to see the aristocrat Cenobites and the clown Cenobites. That'd have been so cool. And then there's the Hell Dog, or wolf, I'm not exactly sure. But Pinhead has this pet wolf dog called the Cheddar Beast. And it means, one of two things. Either hell is some kind of evolutionary design, or all dogs don't go to heaven.
Oh, come on. Why would you think that's funny?
No. I looked it up later in life, so I know it's a man formed into a dog-like shape. Probably a kink of some kind. And listen, I ain't here to shame. Dig what you dig, dude. Life is short. There's a lot going for Bloodline if only one can see past the interference. And listen, I get why it's unpopular. Like the assembly cut of Alien 3, you would need to look upon it from afar, see the intentions, what was eventually left in, and its overall purpose. It's not a movie for casual fans, I get it, but if you care about the series and are into this world, this movie works. Even as screwed as Bloodline was from the moment the budget cuts hit, there was a great story here, filled with one of the series' best villains, even if I wish Vargas's voice was left in. Though I gotta give some props because it's actually great ADR.
Then I would like your permission to go by myself.
Then I would like your permission to go by myself.
Bloodline is a flawed but fitting end, and one that if left intact could have been the best sequel we got. Now, if interested, Atkins actually recently put out his original screenplay, showing the original vision he had. And I'm sure someone's saying, who would buy the original Hellraiser Bloodline script?
Me. I would.
And they should have been included in the Great Scarlet box set. And according to IMDb, I just found out that it was supposed to be. But Arrow declined since it was an unpopular entry. Like, wait, what? Bitch, you're Arrow Films, not Criterion. You put out schlocky movies. This is the point, man. Step up. So next time you want to give this entry a hard time, do me a favor and give it one more go. It's better than you remember if you are willing to look.
Seems like the world is moving on. Didn't stop to look around. Didn't give a shit if you're crashing down. You can close your eyes but not your skin. Don't believe what you refuse to see.